Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI as we say. My name's Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CIGI. Thank you for joining us at the campus for this evening's lecture. Thanks also to our public events sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CIGI Signature Lecture Series. We also thank those who are joining us through the live webcast tonight. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience if you're watching at home through the chat function on your screen, and if you're here in the auditorium at the microphones at the bottom of the stairs. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Our topic tonight is Managing Conflict in a World Adrift, which also happens to be the title of a blockbuster new book co-published by CIGI. Now, in the past year, we've seen the crisis in Ukraine escalate. We've seen diplomatic relations with Russia crumble, the escalating war against ISIL or Islamic State in Syria. With each of these events, there have been corresponding shifts in the economy, international policies, and international conflict. Tonight, Pamela Aall, CIGI Senior Fellow and Senior Advisor for Conflict Prevention and Management at the United States Institute of Peace, will look at how these events and others like them affect global security, and how peacemaking and conflict resolution will need to adapt and evolve in this time of flux. Pamela comes to us tonight from Washington, D.C., where she's based. She joined CIGI's Global Security and Politics team in May 2014 to lead a project examining Africa's regional conflict management capacity and gaps. In addition to her roles at CIGI and USIP, Pamela is also on the board of Women in International Security and is a senior associate at Facilitating Peace, a consulting network of conflict resolution specialists. She's an expert in conflict management, resolution, and reconciliation, as well as mediation, negotiation, and conflict analysis. Now, you may have seen in the program invitation that tonight's event was to include Fen Hampson, Director of CIGI's Global Security and Politics Program, and together with our featured speaker, a co-editor of this book. But Fen is under the weather and has doctor's orders to stay at home, so if you're watching the webcast, Fen, please get well soon. Just another word about Pamela. Well, she's based in Washington. She's married to a Canadian. Her kids are Canadian. One of them lives in Vancouver, and he married a Canadian. So we're very happy to have her in Canada. Please welcome Pamela Aall.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fred, and many thanks to CIGI for inviting me here tonight. I am delighted to be here. As Fred said, we have lots of ties with various parts of Canada, although I keep telling my husband, the Canadian, I'm here a lot more than he is these days. So he is in Zanzibar right now, but he sends his greetings. I should say one child married a Canadian, the other married an Australian, so I'm not quite sure if there's a message here or not. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, just so you know where I'm coming from, but then I will be talking about the world adrift and what we can do, and look forward to hearing your ideas at the end. I was at USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, which, for those of you who don't know it, is a congressionally funded, what they call a federal institution in Washington, D.C., established by Congress in 1984. It's been functioning since 1986. For the purpose of increasing capacity, not just in the United States, but all over, for conflict resolution. And interestingly enough, USIP always had an educational mandate, which in the sort of think tank world in Washington was unusual from the very, very beginning. Recently, it's become a much more operational institution, so it has a lot of active programs on the ground. And at USIP, I worked in the education and training area and started USIP's Academy for Practitioners, among other things. And I know an awful lot about, or I've seen an awful lot of the role that education can play, both in promoting and in resolving conflict. But my main area of research, and the one that I have worked with Fen Hampson and our colleague Chet Crocker on the most, has been mediation. My experience in working in conflict has been largely working with academic institutions, educational institutions, and civil society. So I've not only worked in Washington, but I have worked not as a resident, but in countries in conflict, particularly through their educational institution. I've done a lot of training for practitioners. Some of them have been officials of governments, some of them have been at the UN, and a lot have been in civil society. I've worked in or on programs in the Philippines, Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, Israel, Palestine. And I have experience in a lot of other countries, including Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the Basque Country in Spain. I'm telling you this just so you get a sense of, in a way, where I'm coming from. This is also a very good practice in the conflict resolution field. You never start a program without telling people exactly who you are and where you're coming from, because an awful lot of work in conflict resolution depends on getting the trust, or at least the acceptance, of the people you're talking to. So I can't help it. I have to tell you who I am. Tonight, I'm going to talk about managing conflict in a world adrift. And as Fred said, it's a really good time to do it because Fen Hampson and Chet Crocker and I have just published this book. And it is a book, we didn't write it, we edited it. It brings together about 40 people, some of whom are here at CIGI, who are experts in the area of conflict management and governance, or conflict management and security, some aspect of managing conflict. It's a pretty big book. And we always make jokes about, well, if you can't use it for anything else, you can use it for a doorstop. But I found out exactly how lethal it was the other day when I dropped it on my foot on the edge and hobbled around for the next hour or two. So it does work as a weapon if you need it. We didn't really mean to put together a book on managing conflict in a world adrift. When we started out in 2011, we called the book Managing Conflict in an Age of Awakening, as if we anticipated a new renaissance after the dark ages of the previous century. It was right after the social and political revolutions in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, and the seeming spread of democratic fever all over the Middle East and North Africa, and even Myanmar, a regime that had been as closed as a clamshell around its suppressed society. So we were seeing these enormous changes. The world seemed to be awakening in other ways as well, not all of which we understood. China was beginning to be active in ways that we hadn't seen before, flexing its military muscle in its own region, and at the same time investing in Africa like mad. And it was an unusual combination of looming giant at home and eager shopper abroad. We weren't sure where this was going, but we hoped, we, meaning the editorial team, we hoped that the liberalizing pull of commerce and trade would triumph over the threatening push of national expansionism. There were other signs of awakening as well. The recognition that civil society was an important member of the political community. There was a strong push to bring previously unheard voices into the mix, and especially around women. And the embrace the UN gave of the issue of involving women in peace processes and larger foreign affairs and international relations were in a way encapsulated in the Security Council Resolution 1325, which basically asked nations of the world to increase the amount of women who were active in the foreign affairs field. And countries all over the place started to put together national action plans to bring women into the political sphere. The use of computers obviously been going on for some time, the internet, but I think we were just starting to really understand what a transformative element this was in human interaction. And it seemed all to point for the good. There was an assumption that this was a benign technology which brought openness and transparency and the empowerment of civil society actors. But at some point in the long development of this book, and it was just published in December, so you see, it was a long time in the making, we started to see the Age of Awakening turning into what we call the world adrift. And it was not just that the Arab Spring turned into the Arab Winter, or at least revealed to us the huge complexities of making a transition from authoritarian states and military regimes to something else in a zone of weak states and contested national visions. And it wasn't just that the long march to democracy suddenly started to double back as Vladimir Putin seemed to gain popularity at home, the more provocative he was abroad. And leaders like the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban started to implement his plan for an illiberal democracy in his own country. So the book became The World Adrift, not The Age of Awakening. And one of the questions is, well, why exactly are we adrift? You know, why use that term? We could have said almost anything else. Why adrift? And essentially, there are lots of reasons that we picked this, and a lot of people have actually been talking about it, but mainly these reasons have coalesced around two. One is the rapidly changing world, and in our field, the effect that that has on the security threats and conflict that we see. And the second is the absence of global leadership in the conflict management and peace building sphere. And I should just make clear that my remarks really are around conflict and responding to conflict. When I use the word conflict management, I don't mean a very limited, let's stop the fighting. We use the term to encompass all parts of the conflict responding cycles, so conflict prevention, conflict management, conflict resolution, conflict transformation. It's a shorthand term, but don't mistake me for saying, oh, all you have to do is stop the fighting and then things are better. So let's look at these two reasons, the reasons that the world seems to be adrift a little bit more closely. First, the complexity of current conflicts. When we say complexity, it covers actually a whole range of complexities. These conflicts are complex in their causes. Looking at Africa or Afghanistan, you can find a whole mix of conflict over legitimacy, over identity, over who gets to rule, and conflicts that are caught, contagious conflicts that are caught by countries who live in turbulent neighborhoods. So complex in their causes. But they're also complex in who exactly is fighting. The recent attacks on the magazine Charlie Hebdo, the French satirical magazine, shows this really pretty well, and particularly at first. If you remember, there was just a lot of confusion about who were the attackers. Was this an internal French problem? Was it an external problem? Was it funded by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? What about the relationship to others on the terror watch lists in Europe? So who were these people? And the target of the attack is not always evident, as the Hebdo murders show. You know, who was being murdered? Well, we know it was the staff of the magazine, but symbolically, what was the point? Was it to shut down this very provocative magazine, provocative in some people's eyes? Was it to set an example for other places that felt that they had something provocative to say in the international sphere? Maybe it was an attack on the French government for its role in Syria and the Sahel, or an attack on Western civilization in general for its relativist and amoral messages. Or was it an attack on the concept and practice of the freedom of speech? So we don't know. I mean, we all have ideas, but we don't actually know. And the reasons that people are fighting are unclear. We might say it's because of identity or legitimacy, but where does that deep anger that leads you to kill other people come from? So there are many complexities around conflict today that used to be easier, at least for us to be able to explain to ourselves. We knew who the enemy was during the Cold War, during the Second World War. Today, it's a very confusing scene. The second reason that a lot of people say that we are adrift is because of leadership. And here you can take your pick who you're talking about, and it could very well be my government. And I can tell you, we hear an awful lot about absent US leadership, both from domestic commentators and from abroad. It could be the UN's leadership. The UN seems to have pulled back. The great respected institution does not seem to be playing the same kind of role as it used to. It could be the dysfunctional Security Council of the UN that does not seem to be able to get its act together around what to do about conflicts in other parts of the world. It could be under-resourced regional organizations, not able to lead because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the money. It could be the role that Russia and China are playing, not leadership on the conflicts management side, but rather leadership on a more provocative, more sometimes antagonistic side. What is true is that political leaders do not seem to be able to act with the authority that they have in the past. They do not seem to be able to have impact on the conflict management sphere as they have in the past, and to gain traction. Well, why is this? Well, certainly in my country, it is certainly partly due to polarization. We do not have consensus on much, on any policy. But it's also due to the uncertainty that I think leaders and our principal institutions feel about how do you navigate in this new kind of conflict. So one of the consequences of this adriftedness, this feeling of being adrift, is a loss of sense of control, a loss of sense of agency, a loss of sense of being able to do something about it. We certainly don't mourn the Cold War, but to have an enemy is always useful in providing a unity of purpose. And let me give you an example from my own family. During the 1950s, there was a real fear of Soviet airstrikes against the United States. And the Eisenhower administration, Republican administration, launched something called the Ground Observer Corps, also known as Operation Skywatch. My stepfather, Jim Perkins, an avowed Democrat who had worked in FDR's Office of Price Administration with John Kenneth Galbraith, and at the time was the vice president of a very liberal institution, the Carnegie Corporation, was a proud member of this Operation Skywatch and spent evenings scanning the skies, the night skies over Princeton, New Jersey, looking for Soviet aircraft in support of a policy established by a Republican administration. And this was a serious commitment for a man who really didn't like the outdoors very much at all. And I don't think he ever saw very much, except maybe a falling star, but he didn't talk about that, so we're not even sure what he saw when he was out there. But he was going to do his part. It's very different today. We are so politically divided. And while we may know what the threats are, they're Boko Haram, they're ISIL, they are criminal gangs in Mexico, the nuclear ambitions of Iran, there's very little consensus about what we can do about it. Today's equivalent to Operation Skywatch in the United States is the Department of Homeland Security, and this is the name of the program: If you see something, say something campaign. I didn't know they called it that, but that is its name. But it's not always clear what we're looking for and who we should actually tell, other than the local police, which we've always done. When the threat is a very different vision of the world, a very different vision of the political compact, and is both threatening and remote, it's very difficult to arrange our reactions. You don't know how to react. It's very disorienting. And even in the new way that warfare is conducted, there's very little feeling of agency. I mean, you're not going out for Operation Skywatch to do your part anymore. Volunteer armies, cyber warfare, and even drones, and of course one just landed on the White House, leave us with this feeling that the fight is more remote than ever, and there's not really very much we can do about it. The irony is that all of this is happening in a time of social media, when each one of us is taking much more control of our own lives, and we are much more involved in the safety and welfare of faraway people in such activities as aid, as communicating through social media, watching YouTubes of what is happening in places that would have been almost impossible to visit before. We're much more involved in the support of human rights, of women's rights, of the UN principle of the responsibility to protect. So it is we felt a moment to capture this adriftedness and what the impact it is having on conflict management. So by now you're probably coming to the conclusion that there's really very little that we, as third parties, as people outside of a conflict, can do about a conflict. I've just spent the last whatever amount of time on telling you how difficult it is. Well, there is a lot we can do, and there's a lot we are doing, both governments, the UN, regional organization, private people. There's diplomacy, negotiation, mediation, civil society development, civil society partnerships, economic development, capacity building, educational exchange. And for those egregious human rights abuses, there's still the option of armed intervention. These are all tools that are still at our disposal, and I think we're getting much better at using them. But in order to use them really well, we need to improve our own capacity to function in this world adrift. And we basically need to improve on 3 fronts. We need to improve our ability to know what's going on better than we do now. We need to improve our ability to understand what we can do better than we do now. And we need to be prepared to operate in a very different environment than we have been operating in the past. So sometimes when people are talking about big changes, they turn to important people to help reinforce their points. They might turn to a statesperson or a well-known journalist or a person of international repute like Shakespeare or Mandela or Gandhi. So I thought I would do the same in this talk. And I have decided to turn to Ogden Nash. Ogden Nash, you know him, the American poet who wrote, "Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker." Nash may not be the first name that comes to mind on the topics at hand, but he does have actually a lot to offer, mainly because he really understood the human condition. And as warfare seems to be basically a human activity, that really helps. So on the first one, we need to know what is going on much better than we do. Nash was very clear. We have to be better at getting to the bottom of things, especially the points of view in an argument. Is there any Ogden Nash expert in the room? Well, recite along if you are. Take, for example, his poem, "Which the Chicken and Which the Egg?" He drinks because she scolds, he thinks. She thinks she scolds because he drinks. And neither will admit what's true, that he's a sot and she's a shrew. This is perhaps a little rough, but what Ogden is doing is getting to the heart of the matter. In a conflict, there are many, many different narratives of what is driving the conflict. And every side has its own deeply held beliefs of what that conflict is about, who started it, who is to blame, and the way the causal arrows go. There are feelings of victimizations on both sides, or on all sides. I mean, you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the conflict that we're watching now between Ukraine and East Ukraine. There's a very difficult issue of separating the positions of the parties, what they say they're fighting about. The problem is you drink. No, the problem is that you're always on my back. That's what these two people are saying this conflict is about. But you have to separate that from the underlying causes, and who knows what the fundamental underlying causes of this unhappy couple really are. Without understanding the underlying causes and the options for addressing those issues, it's going to be very difficult to emerge from this cycle of violence, be it physical or verbal. So, what does it mean to be better at conflict analysis? It sounds very technical. And it is in some ways. First, we need to know the facts. And facts are very elusive in a conflict. This doesn't mean that we need to sweep up metadata on every cell phone call. But it does mean that we have to know who the parties are, and we have to know who they are talking to, who their supporters are. We have to really understand their positions, and, as I said before, their underlying needs. We have to know who we can ask for help in this conflict. There are lots of groups that we are fighting today. Al-Qaeda, ISIL, Boko Haram, and others, for which we have only the vaguest of answers to these questions. Information gathering is going to take a long time, and it depends on developing relationships with people we are not talking to, we don't want to talk to, and may not be able to talk to, at least according to American law. But facts are not enough. You need them, but they are not enough. Remember what Ogden said about denial, that neither of his fighting couple will admit what's true. Unless you are in an arbitration of some sort, the facts of the conflict will only take you so far, because they are always contested. Beyond the facts, we need to know the history and the role that it plays in the conflict. We need to know when each party thinks this conflict started, and we don't have to agree with either side, but we have to know what the parties think. I think we always have a tendency of saying, well, so-and-so is right. I've listened to the two sides, and I really think so-and-so is right. In conflict management, sometimes you just have to put that aside and say, I don't know who's right, but I know what they think. We need to know the stories that people tell about the conflict. And these may be folk stories, these may be stories in the newspapers, but they have ways of talking about the conflict that we have to get very, very familiar with. We need to know the stories that people tell about each other. I remember working in the Philippines, or working on the Philippines, being told by one of my Filipino companions that she remembered a book, a children's sort of nighttime book when she was growing up, that basically said, if you don't go to sleep, then the Moro, the Muslim, the Moro will come and kidnap you. So you better go to sleep. Well, these are stories that, you tend to, if you get them as a young child, it tends to form attitudes. We have to understand that. There's another example that I want to give about the conversation between ETA, the Basque separatist/terrorist group, and the government of Spain. I was told this by a man who lives in the Basque part of the country. His one parent was Spanish, one parent was Basque. He has been working for peace for 20 years there. And he said that he was always amazed by the inability of the two sides to hear each other in the Basque conflict. That basically the ETA and ETA supporters were asking for recognition, were asking for respect. And the Spanish government heard them ask for that, but couldn't believe that that was a strong enough reason for them to do this targeted assassination over all of these years. So even though they were hearing each other, they weren't believing each other. At least the Spanish government was not believing ETA. And it just meant that, there was, if there had been any possibility of negotiation at that point, it was lost. 2, we have to know what we can do. So, Ogden. Some debts are fun when you are acquiring them, but none are fun when you set about retiring them. And this is Ogden at his most realistic. We learned as a country, in the United States at least, you were much better here in Canada, we learned something about the pain of retiring debts during the financial crisis of the past 7 years. And despite these experiences, we have remained a deeply optimistic country. And this may have its advantages in some areas, but in dealing with conflicts, it seems that we have a strong partiality for overconfidence. We always assume that things will end up well, and that end will come really pretty quickly. As Nash says, man, and he did use man, he could have been talking about all of us, but maybe he was only talking about men. Man is a victim of dope in the incurable form of hope. One of the things we have difficulty being realistic about, at least in the United States and in some other places, is how to end wars and how to bring peace. Between these two tasks, we probably know more about how to end wars militarily, but the whole complex task of helping a society get back on its feet again is difficult to most people who are engaged in this complex task of building peace. Some of us will remember the 2003 video of President George W. Bush announcing the end of major combat operations in Iraq. And he was standing on the aircraft carrier, the Abraham Lincoln, in front of a banner, and the banner said, "Mission accomplished." This immediately became controversial and stayed controversial because A, it seemed to define victory as a military mission. B, it was not at all the end of major military operations in Iraq. And C, it seemed completely out of touch with reality. And I remember this point very well from my perch at USIP. There was a lot of talk about an in-depth study that the State Department had done on the serious state rebuilding challenges that we would get into once we got rid of Saddam Hussein. This was an effort that was largely ignored by the Department of Defense. Others, however, also chimed in, more or less with the same message. The Council on Foreign Relations issued a report in June 2003 on Iraq the day after. And it was chaired by State Department veteran Thomas Pickering and former Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger. And the chairman's statement there said, "The absence of a clear vision and a strategy to shape Iraq's political landscape has undermined the progress in the post-war transition and created uncertainty among Iraqis." And a few years later, Pickering, the same Thomas Pickering, said just about the same thing about Afghanistan. He said, "We had a failure to define with precision and clarity what our objectives are. The danger is not knowing where we want to go and seeking to achieve much more than we can possibly achieve." This last quote comes from an article in a journal called Survival by Dominic Tierney, and he's a professor at Swarthmore. And it came out last September. And basically he was asking the question, why doesn't the US plan better for the conclusion of war, what he calls mastering the end game of war? And what he found was, as a country, we are somewhat allergic to nation building and find it difficult to include it in our planning. But he also found something really quite interesting in the way we prepare for war. As part of his investigation, he looked at a massive war game called Millennium Challenge. And he found that when the players for the other side, and these are top US military strategists playing the adversary. So he found when the players for the other side were able to outfox the Americans, they were asked to stop, and the game was reorganized so that the Americans came out on top. In the words of Chet Crocker, our colleague on this book, how can we learn from war games if we always win them? Most of my work has had very little to do with armed intervention. It has much more to do with the peace side of the equation. But we have some of the same problems in my part of the field. We often learn those lessons we want to learn, and we skip the lessons we don't want to learn. We need to take a much better look at ourselves and understand what we can do, what we can't do, and also what we're willing to do. Number 3, we need to be able to cope with a new world much better than we seem to be doing right now. And finally, and briefly, I'm going to go back to Ogden, who really wants us to understand we have to be ready to cope with a rapidly changing world, a world that is transforming itself so fast we can hardly keep up. Take, for example, reacting to the kind of targeted, identity-based violence that we are seeing in large parts of the world. Boko Haram, the Lord's Resistance Army. And there's a growing consensus on the nature of the threat of violent extremism resulting from the mobilization by radical ideologues. I've already talked about that a bit. But what do you do about this? You really can't defeat them militarily. You can't use sanctions. Sometimes you can't find them. You can't use diplomacy. And so the current policy revolves around something called countering violent extremism. This is an indirect approach that focuses on changing the conditions in which the conflict is coming out of, and reaching hearts and minds, reaching people inside the conflict area to inoculate them in some ways against radicalization. This is something quite new for us. This is uncharted territory, especially for government agencies who are not used to dealing with hearts and minds. Dealing with civil society, dealing with small community groups, not as a powerful actor to an unpowerful actor paradigm, but dealing with them as partners. It's very different. This is very familiar to a lot of NGOs who have been doing this kind of work forever, but they have never called it countering violent extremism. So working on what they call CVE, countering violent extremism, changes the rules, just as working on conflict in the current environment changes the rules. It means much closer cooperation, as I said, between governments and civil society, both in the conflict country and in the outside countries or institutions who have come in to help. It means a much deeper understanding of the role of social institutions, education, the media, religion, the role that they play in defining the conflict environment. It means taking cues from partners within societies that are experiencing the conflict. It means depending on insider partials. That's a technical term, meaning people who are working for peace, like my Basque friend, people who are working for peace inside their societies, who are not outside mediators, who are well known to everybody in the society, Their partiality is well known to everybody inside the society, but they are accepted as peacemakers. This is a very special group of people. So it means working with them to help guide the external activities. It means taking the lead from the people who are the most familiar with the conflict, the people who are inside the conflict. We've used a term, collective conflict management, in this book and in other books, to describe a new way of approaching conflict. This is when institutions, unlike institutions, come together to solve a problem. These are often very ad hoc. They'll come together over one problem. It won't be a long alliance. It might include governments, NGOs, private people, regional organizations. And as I said, gathered to solve a problem. There's one of these in the Philippines called the International Contact Group. And the members include Britain and Turkey and I think Saudi Arabia, and then 3 NGOs, one of which is the Secretariat. This is a very different model for most governments, for most regional organizations, for most international organizations. So we see this, this practice of collective conflict management becoming more and more important as we face these problems that we are not quite understanding and we're not quite seeing our role clearly. We need to collaborate with other institutions that can help fill in where we, whoever we are, Canada, the United States, the UN, where we are not able to engage as well. So very different collections of conflict management groupings. The conflict management crew in this world adrift will have to be decisive and flexible, informed and intuitive, prudent and creative, entrepreneurial and even-handed, and with a good sense of when to take the lead and when to leave that lead to others who can do it better. And these are attributes that rarely go together in the same person, the same institution, the same country. These are going to be difficult for us to acquire. But we need to work to acquire them. We need to work to change the way we see conflict and respond to conflict, lest we stop being adrift and are swept away by turbulent seas. Not to belabor a metaphor, but I had to come back to it. And so what is the Nash quote that I was talking about that reminds us to be better prepared for a different future than the present we know now? The trouble with a kitten is that eventually it becomes a cat. So with that, I would be delighted to take questions and hope to be able to engage in some discussion here for the next, how much more time do we have? 15 or 20 minutes. Happy to take questions about the work that we do, the book, the work that we are doing for CIGI, or just concerns that you have about the way conflict is entering into your lives or into the world today. No questions. Questions?
Yeah, thank you, Pamela, for this wonderful lecture. Essentially, I'm Joseph Wall, and I'm helping South Sudanese community in a peace-building organization here. My questions, I don't want to go back to why I have not heard of the civil conflict raging on in South Sudan, where we have between 40 to 100,000 lives have been lost, which is a tendencies of grave human rights violations and abuses that are out there in the world, but I have not heard about it. Essentially, that's not important. What is important to me is the issues that you have raised, the two critical issues, the leadership aspect that we now experience worldwide. And my questions now goes to you as an advisor to USIP, which has a bigger role in policies to the State Departments and the US administration. What is the current projection with respect to the resolution of South Sudan crisis, bearing in mind the conflict among the 15 member nations of Security Council and the regional issues attached to the resolution of the conflict?
I'm not an expert on South Sudan. You are. And so I will not be able to answer your questions specifically. South Sudan didn't come in as an example, but it should have. So the omission was my fault. It is the story of Sudan is really one of the tragedies of watching a conflict come to an end. And there was a peace agreement in Sudan. This is the old Sudan. There was a peace agreement in Sudan that was not perfect, but it basically promoted some sort of power sharing. It talked about the division of natural resources, oil resources, and Sudan has a lot of them. And it said that after 6 years, the South would be able to, through a referendum, decide whether he wanted to stay part of Sudan or wanted to become an independent country. And after 6 years, the South Sudanese, through the referendum, decided to become an independent country. Now, if you read that on a piece of paper, it all sounds like this is a best practice. It was a negotiated agreement after a 30-year war. They talked about power sharing. They talked about resource sharing, revenue sharing. They had a part of the agreement that allowed self-determination after a cooling off period and time for reflection. So I think there was actually a lot of hope when the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed. The conflict in Darfur started, I think it was before the signing of the CPA, and you will know more about this than I do. But it was very clear that even at the time of the peace agreement, there was this raging conflict going on in the northern part of Sudan that was going to deflect all attention to that conflict. So that its moment of birth was really very unfortunate in a lot of ways. Even though they had resolved on paper the conflict between the North and the South, conflict was still part of everyday life in Sudan. As the South Sudan gained its independence, it had to struggle, as a very small new country. At that point, it has some resources, but it doesn't have the infrastructure that it needs. And so it struggled along for some time until there was this tremendous ethnically, tribally based split between the leadership, which has torn it apart. So again, from the outside, what you see is the situation of a country that had in fact won its independence being rent by a really vicious fight over power. So I'm sorry I didn't talk about it. It is a very serious conflict and it's a tragic one. It's a really tragic one. The United States would like to see South Sudan at peace. And I think, as much as USIP can do, it is working in South Sudan. But it's working mainly with civil society. This is what we do. We work with the State Department, but there is a bit of a firewall between US policy and the work that USIP does. So we've been working a lot with universities, with civil society groups, bringing in conflict resolution capacity. There are lots of little tiny conflicts going on as well, over resources and so forth. So in that sense, we are trying to help, but this is a vicious conflict, and I think it's going to take serious action on the part of the African Union and the UN and the US and other friends of the Sudanese people to put pressure on the parties to settle. So, but I'd be interested to hear from you afterwards what your thoughts are.
Hi, how are you? So you've expressed the importance of introducing yourself before asking a question, so I will do the same. My name is Aya. My background is, I'm actually Iraqi. I was born there. And I'm also a student here at the Balsili School. So my question is naturally about Iraq. Considering the conflict that's been happening since the 2003 invasion, and it's been ongoing, there's been different actors, there's been different reasons and causes for it, and right now there's the ISIS factor. And so I wanted to ask you, and you've also mentioned that you've also worked in Iraq, and so to what extent do you think education can help curtail the threat or the disruption that ISIS is currently doing in Iraq, considering that there's Kurds who have different perspectives, there's Sunnis, there's Shias, there's Yazidis. So how can we use education to, I don't know, limit the threat or limit the violence, or I don't know.
It's a very good question, and I hear in your voice the same kind of appeal that I feel about thinking about education. If people only understood better, they wouldn't be fighting. It's obviously not that simple. What I saw in Iraq, and it's been a number of years since I was there was a tremendous eagerness to learn. There was an openness to learning about conflict resolution, to learning about human rights. And what was interesting to me was that the faculty, the older faculty in the universities, had often been educated, had often gotten their PhDs abroad. They understood civil society. They'd seen it wherever they went, United States, Britain, France, wherever they were getting their PhDs. But it was the middle faculty who had never been able to go abroad that had a hard time understanding the concept of civil society and the role of a civil discourse in a democracy. And I think, you know, given enough time, I think education makes a huge difference in opening up new avenues of being able to talk to other people, giving you the vocabulary to be able to reach out, making things that used to be strange not so strange. But in Iraq's case, it needs a little time for that to happen. I used to be very optimistic about Iraq. Given the threats right now, I have to say I'm not feeling it has the capacity, but it doesn't have the room to develop it now. But I think education is critical, and frankly, I think even if it is hopeless, even if you're educating in in the middle of a very strong conflict, there are always people who want to hear the message. And they're often young people, but sometimes they're old people. They want to hear the message. They are looking for a way out. One of the principles of conflict resolution is sometimes you're just trying to give people a way out. They want to end their conflict, but they can't figure out how to do it, or it's embarrassing. They'll lose face. So education can at least help shape this idea of the way out of some of the conflicts. I don't know if that answers your questions. I mean, the northern part of Iraq was quite early in its establishment of conflict resolution programs in the 3 or 4 northern universities. So back in the day, they were very active in this area, and one hopes they're still doing the same. But there is a question here on the screen. Can you comment on the role of media in shaping the narratives and urgency of conflict and conflict intervention? And this is from James from Waterloo. So the role of media. Media plays a huge role in shaping the narrative. And it's usually a very destructive role in most conflict settings. The media, it's not necessarily that the media takes an editorial point of view against one group or another, although it probably does. But the media also wants to sell papers. So it is much more lucrative to basically write in what we used to call the yellow press way, you know, demonizing groups, because that sells newspapers. So the media in a lot of these conflicts you know, has played a very deleterious role. Some of you may remember the role of the, was it the Radio Mille Collines in Rwanda, which was radio stations broadcasting hate speech against the Tutsis, run by radical Hutus, but hate speech against the Tutsis, and it is one of the means by which they mobilized those you know, conflict-mad crowds. However, there's been a lot of work in this area, and there have been a number of institutions that have worked with journalists to make them more aware of their role in promoting or resolving conflicts, and developing what these institutions called conflict-sensitive reporting. And it doesn't mean, these institutions are not saying you have to report good news or you have to be absolutely even-handed, but basically what their messages are is that your choice of words makes a difference. And if your story is just as good using a less explosive term, use it. Beware of yourself as a participant in the conflict. And the institution I know the best, I mean, it sounds like I'm talking about something that, you know, you'd go to in London or in Tokyo, but the institution I know the best was in Colombo, in Sri Lanka. So they were working with their own media on trying to get the media to be more responsible in its actions. But I think we need to understand the role of all of these social institutions. I mean, the one I know the most about is education, but these social institutions play a very strong role in basically setting the story that a culture defines itself by. So if you don't mind me going back to textbooks, think about that book in the Philippines that, you know, used the story of the Moro is going to come and get you if you don't go to sleep. The textbooks in the Philippines actually didn't really talk about the Muslims in Mindanao at all. They just didn't exist. So you could grow up in the Philippines, going all the way through grade school, and really have almost no information about this important island to your south and the people who live there, not even their culture. So it's media of all sorts, you know, the books, television, theater, music, whatever, very powerful. A lot of work is going on through the arts now in trying to help people change the narrative in their countries. So that's another area of discovery.
Thank you for taking my question. My name is Henry Odwar, and until about 2 months ago, I was a member of parliament in South Sudan and chaired the Committee of Energy and Mining. But it's not about South Sudan. Could you make a differentiation between peace and interest? For example, in South Sudan today, Uganda has intervened, first of all, as part of IGAD to broker peace in South Sudan, but also has sent troops to crop the government, and yet the surplus of trade between South Sudan and Uganda is about $500 million in favor of Uganda. So is there some interest vested here, or is it truly for peace purposes? And to follow this, China recently has become a player in brokering, sending peacekeepers, and yet 5% of oil that China uses comes from South Sudan. So is there some hidden agenda here? And finally, I just wanted to gauge from you, it seems there is some kind of disagreement between State House and the White House in regards to sanctions. Sometimes the State House would say, well, I mean, the White House would say, you know, they don't favor sanctions. But in particular, I'm talking about imposing sanctions on the major players in South Sudan today. The State Department would want, through the UN, to impose sanctions, and the White House does not. So what's the difference here? Is it not the same administration? Thank you.
Yes, it is the same administration. Interests of interveners. Very complicated problem. Who is an uninterested intervener? Hard to find them, actually. The United Nations may be. But when a neighbor intervenes in whatever way, and I don't mean military intervention, I mean takes an active role in its neighboring countries' conflict, it is very definitely following its own interests. Because it's taking a risk, because it has to spend money, because it has something that it wants to prove, maybe to the rest of that part of Africa. So, yes, interests are always there. Should you say this is a very inappropriate intervention because you do have interests? I don't think you have to. I mean, you know, here's the problem with conflict management people. We're all very goal-oriented. And there is a really pretty strong feeling that you have to deal with people and situations you do not like in order to resolve the problem. So if the Ugandans are being helpful, then you may want to say, yeah, they have a strong interest in seeing a certain outcome here, but it is a helpful role they're playing. If it seems that they are propping up one side, then it is a very inappropriate intervention from a peacemaking point of view. But if the goal is peace, if the goal is to stop the fighting, I mean, in some circumstances, you will take what you can get, which is a cessation of hostilities, to see if you can get a political process to grow after that. The United States has interests everywhere. We don't do things without our own interests. And I say this not as a representative of the US government, because I never have been. But I look at my country and the role we play around the world, and we only act in our own interests. And we may make our interest other people's interests as well. But we are, very strongly driven by our own agendas. Does that mean that we should never be in the peacemaking, peace-building sphere? There are a lot of people who would say, no, we shouldn't be. I think we should be if we can play a useful role. It's a really complicated process. It's very, very, very context-specific. And it raises all sorts of ethical questions. The fight between the State Department and the White House, it was ever thus. It's very rare the State Department and the White House feel the same thing about policies. And this is what the National Security Council is actually supposed to organize. So hopefully there will be some sort of policy-making compromise that will come out of the process. But I wouldn't predict the outcome right now. The White House has mainly driven policies in the United States over the last 6 years. So I would assume they're going to win on this one as well. But I don't know. There's one on the screen. Are there two here? Please, go ahead. I'm happy to try to take a couple, at once, if that helps.
Hi, Pamela. My name is Tammy, and I'm 28 at University of Waterloo, Peace and Conflict Studies, my first year. My question is, over the last year, we've all heard so much about Malala Yousafzai and everything that she is trying to do to empower women. Do you find that over the course of years as you've been doing this, do you have any advice for women when they're first coming into this field to approach these topics in a respectful way, but in a way that is still, that we will be taken seriously and we can still offer hope and actual tangible solutions?
Keep doing what you're doing. you know that old saying that half the battle is showing up. I think one of the challenges for women is balancing the rest of their life and their work. And you do see that quite a lot. That at a certain point, and it's at least where I come from, a lot of the burden is still picked up by women, of families, older parents, et cetera, that it's just too much to continue a high-powered career. And even if you go work for a little NGO doing conflict resolution, I promise you it's a high-powered career. You don't have to be in the government. It's a highly intense, all-consuming activity. So, I mean, in some ways, it's thinking out that problem of, you know, how do you include the rest of your life in your work and vice versa? But, you know, I think, as I said, it is, much of this is just more women in the field and not taking no. Women have a hard time with no. So not taking no for an answer, you know, keep on coming back, showing up. But glad for the question.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Oye Kaojay. I'm a legal studies graduate from University of Waterloo. And I had a question about your topic. You mentioned the absence of global leadership as one of the reasons for the conflicts that we see in the world right now. I wanted to ask my first question, which was, what would you want the US to do right now, the US government to do right now, that it's not currently doing regarding the conflict in Iraq and in Syria? And my follow-up question was regarding the US Security Council, with Russia and the US at odds right now, would you say the UN is still a reliable global governing body? And if yes, how can we push past that insecurity or instability that we see in the UN Security Council?
The answer is probably going to be the same to both questions. And it has to do with the US-Russian relationship. Because I think it's going to be very, very difficult to have an impact on Syria, particularly. Not Iraq is different, but on Syria, if the US and Russia are fighting on every possible battlefield that they can find, and I mean metaphorically fighting on every possible battlefield. I am sure, and again, I don't come from inside our government, so I can't verify this. I'm sure we are talking to the Russians. But it does seem to me that the key to both of those real problems, the UN and Syria, lies partly in the US-Russian relationship. One of the things that you have to bring to any conflict resolution effort is pressure on keeping the momentum up, keeping the parties talking, keeping peace on the table. And you don't get that if you have the two of the principal members of the P5 fighting with each other. They cannot apply pressure on, for instance, the Syrians now. I think it's going to be very difficult for the United States. You start hearing signs of changing about our attitudes towards Assad, because we have been so very, very definite that he had to go, absolutely had to go. And you are starting to hear, not officially, not in statements by Obama, but you are starting to hear little cracks in that particular formulation. So I think, again, with a little bit more collaboration, if you want to call it that, at least agreed goals with Russia, and some sort of way of understanding how to manage a transition in Syria, I think there might be some hope, but I'm not optimistic. I'm sorry, I would like to end on an optimistic note. This is a wonderful field, and you can have lots of impact. And please, any student out there, keep going in it, because the one thing that you do feel that you're doing is you are helping other people in the way that they want to be helped. Because so much of conflict resolution, at least from my point of view, is dealing with people. You develop these relationships with people in conflict zones who are experiencing very different things from what you are experiencing. And between conflict zones, I mean, if you come from Sudan, you know, going to Pakistan can be extremely meaningful both for you and for your partners. So please don't give up on the field, even if I ended on a sad note. So.
A few quick comments before we adjourn. First of all, I want to thank Pamela Aall for her lecture this evening. Those of us who follow the news and world events, and as you can tell by the very informed questions here tonight, that certainly includes the CIGI audience, can easily feel unsettled by the kinds of developments that are occurring in the world. You know, we know with each passing decade maybe there are fewer major violent wars, but these self-appointed jihadis who blow up the Boston Marathon or attack our parliament in Canada and the Charlie Hebdo event, these are very unsettling kinds of conflicts that we don't know necessarily how to resolve. And if I could quote Ogden Nash, he said, "Progress might have been all right once, but it's gone on long enough." But Pamela, you taught us tonight that there are definite ways to make progress even in these new kinds of conflicts, including being better at conflict analysis, getting the facts, being clear about realistic and attainable goals, and working with people collectively inside conflict zones to seek resolution. That is all very practical advice on conflict resolution. We appreciate your insights tonight, so thank you again. Now, just as we conclude, Pamela will be outside signing copies of this book, which is on sale tonight for only $40. It's $50 in the store, so that's a big discount. You can buy that outside if you like. And for those listening to the webcast, it's also available to you until midnight through our online bookstore at CIGI Online. Go to the bookstore section. You can buy the book for the same discount price, and we'll mail it to you. An edited video of tonight's webcast will be posted to the CIGI website, and you'll find a blog on tonight's lecture where you can add your own comments. In the coming weeks, we invite you to join us for 2 more public events. On February 3rd, we're excited to bring in experts Marc-Andre Bernier and Douglas Stenton to share their experiences in the hunt for the lost Franklin ships. That lecture is sold out in the auditorium, but you can sign up for the live webcast and watch it online. And then on February 10th, we'll be screening The Island President, a 2011 documentary focusing on then-President of the Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, whose entire nation could be underwater if climate change causes the oceans to rise. So be sure to register online for our events newsletter to get information about these and other events. Thank you for joining us. Have a safe journey home.